All right, so welcome to the American Bird Conservancy Action Fund webinar, Making Bird Conservation Happen. We're going to go through a little year-end update. I appreciate everyone tuning in for an afternoon webinar. I'm your host, Annie Chester, Policy Initiatives Coordinator for the American Bird Conservancy Action Fund. Before we get started, I want to make a few housekeeping notes. This webinar will be recorded. For instructions about captioning about today's event, see the chat. We encourage you to ask questions to the speakers. A great way to do that is the Q&A button at the bottom of your screens. I'm going to just go ahead and kick things off. This webinar is a bit of a different format than some of our other webinars. I'm just going to provide a summary of some of our activities over the past year. Give some background for folks who might be new or not know so much about the Action Fund. And then I will introduce you to some of the American Bird Conservancy policy team rather. And so let's get into it. So who are we, the American Bird Conservancy Action Fund? We are a separate organization from the American Bird Conservancy, but very much connected. We work specifically to advocate for bird conservation policy. So we're really focused on that political part of bird conservation. So we provide a political platform to address key policy priorities. We educate members of Congress and the public about bird conservation. And a big emphasis within our education is promoting bipartisan bird conservation policy. We want to make sure that all communities and constituencies are involved in the process of bird conservation. Engaging members of Congress is super important to our work. We want to make sure, especially that members of Congress that are already engaged in the work of conserving birds or promoting bird conservation are getting the thanks they deserve. So we work really hard to connect with those members of Congress and let them know they're doing a good job. It's really easy for members of Congress to hear what they're not doing right. So we want to make sure to thank them. And that helps in building relationships with members of Congress. And that's super important to getting policy work accomplished. So political advocacy in the larger scope of bird conservation is really important because in context of the American Bird Conservancy and their overall mission of conserving wild birds and their habitats, we need good policy to make sure that conservation programs at the federal level are funded, as well as ensuring that endangered species and habitats and migratory birds are all protected. So the American Bird Conservancy Action Fund has been really engaged in a variety of different things this year. On the legislative side, we were really happy with some of the bipartisan bills that were introduced. So those include funding for migratory bird conservation in the House, the Federal Bird Safe Buildings Act, which addresses collisions, and then some more habitat-focused bills like the Coastal Habitat Conservation Act, and then the Save Our Seas 2.0 Amendments Act. And we'll go into a bit more detail about some of these bills later on, but I just want to highlight that a lot of our outreach and advocacy work has helped encourage these bills either to be introduced or encourage the legislators to continue working on them. On the state level, we've also seen victories with the passage of the Maryland Sustainable Buildings Act, and then in California with the Pollinator Protection Act. We are lucky enough today to be joined by one of our pesticides policy team members who will talk a little bit more about this bill later on. In terms of our congressional relationship building and engagement, we were able to have a Q&A with Representative Rick Larson, who's working on a bill that would enhance some migratory bird funding. We also worked on a really special project this year. This year's the 50th anniversary of the Endangered Species Act, and we were able to produce a special report detailing basically how effective the act has been over its 50 years at recovering threatened and endangered bird species. In tandem with the release of that report, we were able to have Representative Jared Huffman participate in a webinar earlier this year commemorating the act and basically highlighting our report and how That Endangered Species Act is good for birds as well as other wildlife. We also hosted another legislative update webinar. And as I mentioned earlier, education is really important for us. So this is also why we're hosting this webinar, to let folks know about all of the legislation and regulatory issues that birds are facing right now. Here we have just a beautiful picture of a golden eagle, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. And this is the ABC policy team that we really, as the Action Fund, work to support their work. So it's really important that we introduce them so that you have a better connection to knowing what the American Bird Conservancy is working on the policy front. So I want to take a minute to just introduce you to some of these folks. So I'm going to start off by handing it over to Jennifer Cipoletti, who's the Senior Director of Strategic Programs and Government Affairs. So Jennifer, if you would like to say hello and give us a little overview of what you work on, and yeah.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much, Annie. I really appreciate the invitation to be here today and loved hearing all of the updates from the ABC Action Fund. We definitely need your support to get the work done that we need to do. So as Annie mentioned, I'm part of our policy threats, but also our regional teams. And so a big part of my job is to help support our policy folks who are going up to the Hill to lobby members of Congress on behalf of migratory bird legislation and funding. Some of those things that we work on are conservation funding and bills for neotropical migratory birds, the Migratory Bird Joint Ventures, which focuses a lot on habitat and species restoration. I also really love the work that I do on partnerships, and our partnerships across the spectrum are incredibly important to the work that we do. So we have been building really strong partnerships at the federal level, at the state level, at the local level, and that really helps us to engage our networks of constituents and members to figure out how we can leverage their enthusiasm for our work to make sure that we're doing the best that we can for migratory birds when it comes to legislation and really trying to get some increased funding for these programs and give them all the support they need to succeed and to really help with conserving birds in their habitats across the Americas. And so part of what I'm working on is leaning into that network of partners and then figuring out how we can work with our federal agencies and our state agency partners to get some of this work done, to talk about being in the same room when we're having really high level discussions about conservation funding and how that money is spent, and do we have the infrastructure to help support implementation of those conservation programs, which we do. It's really exciting work. Annie and Steve and Hardy and Bronwyn are all doing really amazing work, and we're all very much interconnected. So even though I'm located in Washington, D.C., and I'm doing work in D.C., I'm still working with a lot of these folks across the country to make sure that we're connected. Thank you so much, Annie.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. I'm now going to turn it over to Hardy Kern, our Director of Government Relations, Birds, Pests, and Pesticides campaign. So Hardy, to you.
Thank you so much, Annie. Hello, everyone. I am so glad to have the opportunity to introduce myself. Like Annie said, I'm Hardy Kern, and I am Director of Government Relations for our pesticides and birds work. And you might be thinking to yourself, what on earth do pesticides have to do with birds? They're talked about quite a bit, but mostly in the context of bees and other pollinators, butterflies, things like that. But birds are phenomenal pollinators as well. They are super important to lots of different agricultural products, and they are an integral part of pretty much every single ecosystem. So above my shoulder here and hanging out on my lapel, I have the ruby-throated hummingbird, which is also ABC's logo, and a really important bird pollinator that visits tons of different flowers and agricultural crops and might interact with pesticides that are used there. So what our work as American Bird Conservancy focuses on is strategies at the federal and state level to meaningfully engage with partners, to do legislation and regulation. Pretty much if it ends in Asian, we are involved in it in some way or another. So we do a lot of briefing of members of Congress and their staff We talk a lot with different partners on all sides of the issue, not just other environmental groups, but also manufacturers, agriculture groups, and even folks that might not seem connected to birds, like farm worker advocacy groups or local chambers of commerce, different areas that have levels of influence around the pesticide conversation. And as Jen was saying, our federal partners, our state partners, that's where a lot of our clout comes from. So it's really, really important that we forge these meaningful relationships. And this year we had a fantastic advancement on one of our bills. Annie, is this a good time for me to talk about the California?
Yeah,
Fantastic.
please do.
Yeah, so we had a huge win at the state level in California, a great piece of legislation, AB 363, the Protecting California's Pollinators Act, was signed into law by Governor Newsom. And this bill, this now law, I should say, actually will phase out the use of neonicotinoid insecticides for use on homes and gardens and golf courses and things like that in the next few years, which is phenomenal. It also directs the state to study the impacts of neonicotinoid insecticides in a variety of different uses across the state of California. And this is only made possible because people look to ABC and their action fund as a way to find out which members of Congress, which state legislators sometimes even are very active on these issues. It's helped make us a really reputable source of information on these policies. And it's built a phenomenal network of not only legislators, but stakeholders at all levels of government to, let people know, here's what's going on with birds. Here's the things that we think you need to be informed about. So we're so grateful to have this platform. And it's actually springboarded my work to go into other areas. So not just pesticides, but other environmental contaminants such as lead and even mercury in some cases. But we are really focused on working together with our partners, working across our entire team. And without the vehicle that the Action Fund provides, we wouldn't be able to spotlight the really amazing work being done by members of Congress and all of our partners at the state level. So thank you so much for tuning in today to learn a little bit more about something that I think is exciting, which is pesticides, which isn't traditionally the most, razzle dazzle thing, but it's important work to do, and we're glad to be able to do it.
Thanks, Hardy. Next, I want to turn it over to Bronwyn Runk, who is our development officer. So Bronwyn, would you like to talk a little bit about your work?
Yeah, thank you, Annie. Thank you, everyone, for coming today. My name is Bronwyn, and I've been with ABC for about 1.5 years as the development officer for the government relations program. And that really encompasses the policy program specifically that focuses on a lot of much bigger issues, as well as Hardy's pesticides program, in addition to ABC's Action Fund, or the C4. In addition to that, I actually, much like Jen, have a very broad role where I, within ABC, also work in other regional programs for a lot of on-the-ground conservation efforts that are taking place in the central region, as well as the Southeast and the Mid-Atlantic. My role for this team here in government relations as the development officer is really focusing on interfacing with key program donors as well as private foundations. I work really closely with the talented staff that you see on screen to create compelling cases for support, as well as individual proposals. And so as far as my part in this, I will say that if anyone attending today is interested or knows someone who is interested in directly supporting this work, my contact information will definitely be provided, and I'm happy to chat with you a little bit more about how we can do that and how we can match the work that we're doing to the work you'd like to support. So with that, I will wrap my part up. Thank you, Annie.
Thanks, Bronwyn. Next up, we have Steve Homer, Vice President of Policy. So Steve, I'll turn it over to you and I'll cue up your slides.
Great, thanks, Annie. And I would like to mention that we have another member of our policy team, Steve Riley, who's the Director of Farm Bill Policy. Steve's in a stack of meetings right now and wasn't able to join us, but we are trying to work on the Farm Bill, which is currently the largest source of funding for conservation, and involves habitat work all around the country. So we'll hear from Steve at a future meeting. Thanks. Next slide thing. All righty. Well, looking ahead at the legislative and regulatory overview, we just got some big news about the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. We've been working on an effort to see new regulations that would reduce bird mortality from preventable sources like tall towers and communications for communications and power lines. Unfortunately, we just learned that rulemaking has been somewhat delayed, and we thought it was coming out for public comment very soon. It looks like they have some more technical issues that they want to work through before it comes back around. But this is a really big opportunity to try to uphold one of our nation's oldest laws that has helped recover migratory bird populations, but also extend these protections into areas where birds continue to die needlessly from preventable causes. And so it's particularly where we have good solutions available that we think that they should be made mandatory, be required. And that's really what this whole effort around regulation under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act would do. So we've been working on this effort now since 2012, when we first petitioned the government for a rulemaking. So we are disappointed that this process has been further delayed. There has also been legislation supporting this, the Migratory Bird Protection Act. That bill is still in development for this Congress, but it was really helpful in the last Congress in terms of defining how we can use the Migratory Bird Treaty Act to better protect birds. So we're going to be continuing to work on these efforts with legislation and regulation to better protect migratory birds from preventable causes. Another big legislative effort happening right now is around the Neotropical Migratory Bird Conservation Act. This is a matching grant program that is really the main source of funding for migratory birds overseas. Through this program, American Bird Conservancy has been able to create a system of international reserves. And now we're using these grants to help establish more sustainable development around these reserves so that they can become economically sustainable, self-sustainable. And of course, birding tourism is a major part of how that works and how people can support these reserves. There is a website called conservationbirding.org. And a lot of these reserves now have lodges where you can go stay and support the conservation work that's happening there. So if you're interested in a big birding trip, you might want to check out conservationbirding.org. We're right now working on reauthorizing the Neotropical Migratory Bird Conservation Act. We have a Republican champion in the House, Maria Salazar, and we very much appreciate her leadership. Also, Representative Larson from Washington State is her co-sponsor on the bill. And it's our hope that this bipartisan bill will, in fact, move through this Congress. The idea is to both increase the amount of funding available for the program and also to make it more accessible to our partners. The program currently requires a 3-to-1 match where we have to provide $3 for every federal dollar that's provided. This is proving to be challenging and a barrier in our view, so we would like to change the match formula to be a little more consistent with most other conservation programs which have a 1-to-1 match. We're hopeful to see this bill move through, and we do have a form on our website where you can send a letter to your representative asking them to co-sponsor the legislation. And in a similar vein, the Federal Bird Safe Buildings Act is also been introduced in the House. It's championed by a Virginia representative, Morgan Griffith. We actually just ran into Representative Griffith up on Capitol Hill when we were running around doing some meetings. And he told us a quick story about why he supports this bill, which is that he's personally witnessed bird collisions at the Capitol and at a courthouse in Virginia and some other places. It's something that's personally affected him. And we do have solutions available. There are bird-friendly design practices where we can greatly reduce the amount of collisions that happen with windows at federal buildings. And this is really kind of an example of what can be done. We're seeing similar efforts being undertaken at the state and local level as well. So that's the Federal Bird Safe Buildings Act. And then, of course, we have the Farm Bill coming up. The Farm Bill is the largest source of bird conservation right now. And a lot of what it does is it provides funds for landowners to provide certain types of habitats that birds need and that the landowners desire. And so this is really a huge effort. American Bird Conservancy now has in total about 130 staff people. And a large number of them are doing this type of habitat outreach to landowners. These are biologists and other types of experts who can help landowners create the type of structure and plant life that will provide them the kind of birds that they want to see on their property. Another key area is threatened and endangered species. Preventing the extinction of birds is one of our top organizational priorities. And so we are involved with the listing and protection of critical habitat for quite a few species. If you go back to the previous slide, Annie, there was a picture there of a red knot. Red knot is a species that was listed not that long ago, and it's threatened, but we don't feel like there's yet adequate protection. It's not doing as well as it should under the Act. And a lot of this stems back to fishing and the fishing of horseshoe crabs, which the red knot relies on for fueling their migration. It's a remarkable bird. It has one of the longest migrations of any bird. It starts out down in the very southern part of Argentina, and then it flies all the way to the Arctic, where it breeds up on the tundra. And it tends to stop over on some eastern shores. And it's there that they really need to feed on the horseshoe crab eggs to kind of fatten up, and in some cases, as much as double their weight, and then be able to fly all the way. So this is an example of another species that's of concern. We're right now working to provide more funding for red knot recovery, because we feel like there's simply not adequate resources going into bringing this population back. So it's another example of an area that we work in. Hardy Kern mentioned pesticides. This is another critically important area. We have some champions in Congress who are supporting proactive legislation, and we also have some very important regulatory advances happening right now with the Environmental Protection Agency. And so we're going to be trying to support and influence some of those regulatory efforts as they unfold. Happy to answer any questions. There's an awful lot going on right now, but I would just like to say that the letters that people send to Congress make a big difference. They have a choice of what issues to work on, and so when they hear about our issues, it makes them more inclined to be a leader on our issues. And that is really the whole idea of the Action Fund, is to try to engage our leaders to get them to be even greater. And really the best thing that we found to do that is to do public thank yous. Thank you letters from constituents, letters to the editor that show up in the local newspaper. We've also been doing some targeted ad campaigns that generate letters and then help us build up our base of support within those key districts. So the Action Fund is really a key component of the American Bird Conservancy grassroots advocacy arm. And we're really just getting started. And so, the support that we gain is going to help build ABC's clout so that we can win and achieve the bird conservation goals that we all seek. So why don't I turn it back over to Annie, who can talk a little bit about seabirds.
Yeah,
this gives you an idea on what you can do about what's coming next.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. I'll talk a bit first about seabirds and then talk a bit more about what you can do. So yeah, as the policy initiatives coordinator, one of my initiatives is working more on seabird issues, and seabirds are really threatened by plastic pollution, habitat degradation, and fisheries bycatch. So right now we're working on solutions that address these various aspects of seabird conservation. So we have a plastics policy platform that we are really advocating for members of Congress to support plastic pollution mitigation legislation. In terms of fisheries bycatch, we're really working looking towards next Congress to address it through appropriations. So funding fisheries observers and other ways to mitigate plastic pollution while also addressing the fisheries bycatch issue. So having observers out on the water that can keep track of all of that is one super important way to address that issue. So in terms of what you can do, whether it's seabirds or pesticides or any of the other bills Steve mentioned, is obviously contacting your members of Congress. Through the American Bird Conservancy, they have a really good platform to send letters to your members of Congress. It's in the chat. So based on the issues that interest you, or if you're interested in all of the issues, you can send letters to your members of Congress. And really, you know, for seabird legislation, we need more members of Congress introducing legislation. For pesticides, we need more representatives and senators co-sponsoring these bills. Farm Bill is still in the works. That is something that is going to need a lot of support in 2024, and we're going to need your voice more for that in the coming year. Another thing just to keep an eye out for in the coming year is an ABC spring fly-in. So we're hoping to really rally some support around Farm Bill, as well as some of the other bipartisan bills. So keep your eyes peeled for that. There will be more information coming out, but we wanted to kind of preview that because that is an activity that the Action Fund hopes to support in the spring. So Steve, I will turn it back to you because I think there's one more issue that we need to talk about.
Well, yes, we had a couple of questions. One was about renewable energy, and we do support renewable energy, but we do think that it should be made sustainable in the sense of not, you know, causing any undue harm to bird populations. And early on, Annie showed a picture of a golden eagle, and American Bird Conservancy just petitioned for the listing of the eastern population of the golden eagle as a distinct population segment. And we're very concerned about pesticide, rodenticide impacts to eagles. Lead is also a significant problem there as well. And so so that's one area that we would like to get some action going there to better protect eagles. But at the same time, we want to see support for renewable energy, and it is through development of, you know, bird smart development, doing it right from the start is really kind of the outline, the goal of what we have for renewable energy. And by and large, we feel like we are seeing some progress there in terms of identification of best management practices that can reduce bird mortality, particularly in the area of power lines. Power lines are needed to connect wind farms and solar farms to the grid. And we found that there is significant mortality associated with power lines, and that's from electrocutions and collisions. But this is also an area where we've seen great progress with industry developing best practices. I would argue that we can largely eliminate the electrocutions of eagles and other birds from power lines just by designing them correctly and making sure that the power poles are properly insulated. Another area that we can see tremendous progress is around tall towers. Ever since we first started building tall communications towers back in the 30s, it was discovered that migrating birds would collide with them. During, you know, at night, they would be attracted to the lights, and under certain weather conditions, they would literally kind of get trapped by the towers and just circle them, and there'd be large mass mortality events at these towers. And so we started doing some research on this. And we also petitioned the Federal Communications Commission to change the lighting requirements. Once we had some research in hand showing that by turning off the steady burning lights that were attracting the birds, you could greatly reduce mortality. And if we could see the next slide there, what the research found was that you could reduce bird mortalities by as much as 70% just by turning off those steady burning lights. And so there has been guidance as a result of an American Bird Conservancy lawsuit that directed the Federal Communication Commission to turn off those steady burning lights. And this has been in place since 2016. And this actually saves the tower operators a lot of money. They no longer have to go and maintain those steady burning lights. All the towers already had flashing lights on them. So it's literally a matter of turning off those steady burning lights. And they, of course, will save on the energy that used to be spent to keep them lit and as well as maintained. And so this is an area that we're seeing some steady progress. It is an area that could be regulated under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act general permit idea. And if we could look at the next slide, since this went in place in 2016, we have been seeing steady progress. There's about 14,000 of these tall towers that have the steady burning lights. And about 4,000 of them now have turned off their lights. And we get new reports every couple of years, and it does show that we're seeing some steady progress. We have been doing some regular outreach to the tower operators. There's an app called the Songbird Saver where concerned citizens can identify the towers in their area and then reach out and contact the company. This is a classic win-win where we just simply need to convince these companies to go through the paperwork basically to turn off their lights, and it would actually end up saving them a good deal of money. We hope to see a few of the big operators that literally have a few thousand towers each take this step, and we could largely solve and finish off this problem. There is research going on around some of the shorter towers, which may also be an issue, but this is really a classic example of how we've identified a problem, we've identified a solution, and now we're steadily working to achieve it. And having citizen support and support for our campaigns is critical to make that happen. So thank you. And I think that may be all that I've got today. Are there other questions that we might be able to answer from anybody? Well, I saw that the action alert link is posted in the chat. And again, sending letters to your representatives and senators is really the best thing that you can do, and being a steady voice. And then at the American Bird Conservancy Action Fund, we also have created thank you forms for a number of the top bird conservation champions in Congress. And if you don't see your senator or representative there, well, that's something that we would like to change. We would love to see them be an active leader. But meanwhile, we have some active leaders. They need to hear from people. They need to be encouraged to make this a top priority. So we encourage you to send thank you letters to our champions.
Yeah, thanks, Steve, for mentioning that. And that was just dropped in the chat, a link to the question or the thank you form. And I do see one question came in about power lines, Steve. So is there a simple handout or do you have a simple handout or short document of pictures with which line pole configurations are and are not bird friendly? Is there resources we can share with people about that?
We do have some. I unfortunately, it's not the simplest issue. For electrocutions, line width is really the simple answer to keep the lines far enough in height so that the big birds like eagles can't touch two lines at once. All of this is available and was created through the Avian Power Line Interaction Committee, which was a committee of bird conservationists and energy companies who do power lines. And it's involved a great deal of research. And so, yes, we can get back to you with some more information on that. It doesn't quite fit on one piece of paper, unfortunately. It's a little more, a complicated process in one sense, particularly to deal with collisions. So, yeah, we'll be happy to get you some more on that.
Awesome. Yeah, we will certainly share some resources after this presentation. A recording will come out. And as always, our website is a really great resource. I would really encourage folks to check out the Action Fund's blog page. A lot of the issues we discussed today are described at length there, as well as there's links to action alerts and different things you can do to support bird conservation. So I really appreciate everyone taking the time today to tune in and learn a bit more. I knew we threw a bunch of issues out at you, but kind of just shows all of the things that we're working on and why the Action Fund becomes a really important vehicle for amplifying all of the work at the American Bird Conservancy and just in the bird conservation space more generally. So appreciate everyone supporting our work and bird conservation. So thanks so much. Have a good day, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.